Good evening and welcome back. The hour has grown still and the room around you has begun the slow practice of letting go of the day. The lamps are low, the corners have softened. Whatever the morning brought, whatever the afternoon asked, whatever the evening still holds in its small busy hands, you may begin now, little by little, to set it down. There is no urgency here. The story we are about to enter is older than urgency. It has waited a long time already. It will wait, patient as a lion's skin folded by a quiet fire, for as much of your attention as you can give before sleep takes you. Let your shoulders settle. Let your jaw rest. Let your hands lie wherever they have come to rest, open or folded, whichever feels more natural to the body that has carried you this far. There is no pose to maintain tonight. There is no question to answer before the morning. The day, with all its rough edges, may now begin its slow folding away into memory, and the night, kind and old, may begin to gather you up. Tonight, we enter the story of Heracles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, the man who performed the 12 labours, who fought lions and serpents and giants, who travelled to the ends of the earth and even down into the underworld, who suffered terrible griefs and committed terrible acts, who endured a long life of strenuous deeds, and who at the end was raised to Olympus to become a god among the gods. His story is one of the longest in all Greek mythology. It has more episodes, more turns, more adventures, more sorrows, and more triumphs than perhaps any other heroic tale. We will not try to tell every part. We will tell the shape, the major moments, the famous deeds, and the slow, long meaning that the Greeks drew from his life. We will move through these images slowly. We will not press them. We will let them rise and fade like figures painted faintly on the wall of an old temple, and the listener may drift into sleep at any point along the way without missing what matters. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. You may close your eyes if your eyes wish to close. The story will keep its shape without you watching it. The Greeks who first told the Heracles tales would have understood. He was the hero of their countryside, the hero of their fireside stories, the hero whose name was on the lips of farmers and shepherds and soldiers and small children for many centuries. His stories were told to put children to sleep as often as they were told to entertain warriors before battle. The teller continued. The listener slept or did not, and the story carried on without needing anyone in particular to remain awake. In the beginning of this telling, we must step back to the time when Zeus, the king of the gods, had set his eyes on a mortal woman in the kingdom of Thebes. The woman was Alcmene, the wife of a Theban general named Amphitryon. She was, by all the old accounts, a woman of unusual grace and steady character. Amphitryon was away from home, fighting in a distant war for his city. Alcmene, alone in her house, was managing the household and waiting for her husband's return. Zeus saw her from Olympus. He desired her, but he knew that Alcmene was faithful to her husband and would not receive any other man into her bed. So Zeus, with his usual cunning, took the form of Amphitryon himself. He appeared at her door in the evening, looking exactly like her husband returning from war. He told her stories of the campaign that exactly matched what Amphitryon had actually been doing. He carried her into the marriage bed. That night, Zeus also stretched the night itself to triple its usual length. The sun did not rise. The hours passed slowly. Alcmene, believing she was with her husband, gave herself to the long night, and Zeus, the father of gods, made the most of the extended hours he had arranged for himself. The darkness outside her window was a darkness he had chosen and prolonged, a darkness full of intention and of the quiet workings of divine will. Alcmene heard the same breathing she had always known beside her, felt the same warmth she had always trusted, and did not question a thing. She had no reason to question it. The deception was perfect. The next day, the real Amphitryon returned from the war. He came home expecting a tender reunion. He was confused to find that his wife greeted him without the urgent affection of someone who had been waiting many months. She told him she was glad he was back, but that it had only been a few hours since they had been together. Amphitryon, slowly piecing together what must have happened, consulted the seer Tiresias. Tiresias, who knew most divine secrets, told him the truth. Zeus had come in his form. Alcmene was now pregnant by two fathers in a single night, one mortal and one divine. Amphitryon, in some traditions, was a kindly man. He did not blame Alcmene for what had happened. She had been deceived, not unfaithful. He stayed with her. He raised the children that were born from that long night as his own. From the union with Zeus came Heracles, who would become the greatest of the heroes. From the union with Amphitryon came Iphicles, who was a perfectly capable but unremarkable man. The kind of man who lived in the shadow of a famous brother without resentment. Iphicles grew up knowing that his brother was different, and he grew up making a kind of peace with that knowledge. There is something to admire in such a man. He was not jealous in any bitter or destructive way. He was simply himself, the mortal brother of an immortal hero. And he found his own way in the world, serving where he could, living his own life alongside the vast and turbulent life of his brother. The Greeks honored men like Iphicles too, though they did not always say so loudly. The ordinary person who keeps faith alongside the extraordinary one, who does the quieter work without demanding equal attention, who does not crumble when overshadowed. That person carries a kind of dignity that the mythology sometimes forgets to mention. But Hera, when she learned of Zeus's deception, was furious, as she always was when Zeus took another woman. She set herself against the unborn Heracles even before his birth. When the time came for Alcmene's labor, Hera arranged for Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to be detained, just as she had done for Leto so many years earlier. She also arranged for another woman in the household to give birth first to a son who, by an old oath of Zeus, was supposed to be the ruler of the local people. By making sure this other child was born first, Hera ensured that the kingship, which would have been Heracles's by right, was instead given to a lesser cousin named Eurystheus. From that moment, Heracles was destined to serve Eurystheus, the man who had stolen his birthright through Hera's manipulation. Heracles was finally born. He was a large, strong infant with bright eyes and a vigorous cry. His mother named him Alcides at first, after her own father. He would become known as Heracles, meaning the glory of Hera, only later, after he had begun his labors, perhaps as a kind of ironic name, acknowledging that all his great deeds had been driven by Hera's hatred. The name has stuck. The Romans called him Hercules. The man is known to history by the Greek form, and we will use it tonight. Hera was not finished with him. Even as the infant lay in his crib, she sent 2 serpents into the nursery to kill him. The serpents were large and venomous. They glided across the floor toward the cradle in the middle of the night. But Heracles, even as an infant, was already showing his divine strength. He woke. He saw the serpents. He reached out his small hands. He grasped one serpent in each hand and strangled them both. When his nurse came in the morning to check on the children, she found Iphicles crying in terror in his own cradle and the infant Heracles laughing with 2 dead serpents in his hands. This was the first of his many deeds. He had not yet been weaned. He had already killed 2 serpents sent by the Queen of the Gods. The pattern of his life was set. He would be a man who faced impossible threats and overcame them through sheer strength and stubborn endurance. The threats would keep coming. The endurance would have to keep coming with them. In the city of Thebes, word of what had happened spread quickly. Amphitryon summoned the great seer Tiresias again. Tiresias told him what the infant had just demonstrated with the 2 dead serpents would one day be demonstrated against creatures 1,000 times more dangerous. He told Amphitryon that the child would not be an easy child to raise, that his education would need to be careful and his teachers patient, that the strength which had just killed the serpents would need to be directed, not suppressed, because it could not be suppressed, only aimed. Amphitryon listened. He believed the seer. He made plans for the kind of education that might give the extraordinary strength some shape and some purpose. The serpents in the cradle were the beginning of a conversation that would last throughout Heracles' childhood. A conversation between what the boy could do and what the world needed done with it. Alcmene, for her part, looked at her infant son in the morning light. She had not been awake when the serpents came. She had been asleep in the next room. Her first knowledge of what had happened was the sound of her nurse's voice calling to her from the nursery. She came in and saw the dead serpents, and saw Iphicles still trembling in his cradle, and saw Heracles reaching toward her with his arms out, wanting to be held, his small face perfectly calm, the 2 serpents curled in the bedding beside him as if they had been placed there as toys. She held him. She did not yet fully understand what he was. She understood it slowly, over many years, as the understanding came to her in pieces, each piece a little larger than the last. Heracles grew. He was tutored by some of the best teachers of the heroic age. The wise centaur Chiron taught him medicine and music and philosophy up in the high meadows of Pelion, where the mountain air was clean and the stars were close, and the centaur's long patient instruction unfolded over many seasons. Chiron was a teacher unlike most. He did not teach by commanding or by shaming his students. He taught by example, by patient demonstration, by the quiet authority of someone who had lived a very long time and had learned to hold knowledge without grasping at it. The young Heracles, still growing into his enormous strength, sat at the feet of the old centaur and learned what it meant to think before acting, to understand the properties of herbs and roots and the behavior of animals and the slow movements of the stars. Whether those lessons ever fully took hold in the moments of passion and rage that would follow is another question. But they were given, and they were received, and they made a difference. The skilled archer Eurytus taught him the bow. The chariot master Castor taught him driving and horsemanship. The brothers Autolycus and Linus taught him wrestling and the lyre. He learned everything the heroic education could offer. He was, by his late adolescence, one of the most accomplished young men in Greece. He could shoot an arrow through a distant target while the chariot was still moving. He could wrestle opponents twice his size to the ground. He could play the lyre with hands that seemed too large for it, and yet drew from it sounds that made people stand quietly in doorways and listen without knowing they had stopped walking. But his strength was already greater than ordinary control could manage. There is a sad early story about his music teacher Linus. Linus, frustrated with the young Heracles for some small fault during a lyre lesson, struck the boy with a wooden plectrum. Heracles, in a flash of anger, struck Linus back with the lyre itself. The blow was too hard. Linus died. Heracles, when he understood what he had done, was inconsolable. He was tried for the killing, but acquitted, on the grounds that he had been struck first and had not meant to use lethal force. But the death of his teacher marked him. He withdrew from the city for a time. He went to live in the mountains, tending cattle, away from human company, until he had grown more accustomed to his own strength. This pattern would recur throughout his life. Heracles was a man whose strength was both his gift and his curse. He could overcome enormous monsters with his bare hands. He could also, in moments of anger or madness, kill those he loved without meaning to. The Greeks were honest about this. They did not pretend that strength alone was virtue. They understood that strength carried its own dangers. Heracles, the strongest of mortal men, was also the one who had most often caused harm without intending it. He returned to Thebes as a young man. He won a series of contests. He helped Thebes in a war against a neighboring city, the minions of Alcmene, who had been demanding a humiliating tribute from Thebes for many years, a tribute of cattle and silver paid as an acknowledgement of Theban submission. Heracles rallied the Theban men, armed them with weapons taken from the temple walls where they had hung as dedications to the gods, and led them to a decisive victory. The minions were defeated. The tribute ended. The men of Thebes returned to their city with something they had not felt in a generation, the sense of not being diminished. The king of Thebes, grateful beyond measure, gave him his daughter Megara in marriage. Heracles loved her. They had several children together. He settled for a time into the life of a contented young husband and father in his home city. He was not, in these years, the famous laborer of legend. He was a man with a house and a hearth and children who ran to him when he came home. He was a man who sat beside his wife in the evening and felt the particular peace of someone who has, for a while, found the right place. In the mornings he would walk in the hills above Thebes and look out over the plain below the city and feel the particular satisfaction of a man who has done something that needed to be done and who has been given a quiet life in return for it. He was not searching for the next task. He was not restless in these years. He was simply present. in the way that the very strong can sometimes be present when the world has, for the moment, stopped demanding anything from them. These were years the mythology tends to pass over quickly because they were quiet years, and quiet years do not make famous stories. But they were real years. They happened. The children were real children, with their own small lives and their own small certainties. Megara was a real woman, with her own patience and her own love and her own particular way of managing a household that contained a man who could bend iron bars with his bare hands. The ordinary life of a hero is almost invisible in the mythology because it requires no recording. It simply lived itself day after day in the way that most good things live, without announcement, and their ending makes what came next so much harder to bear. This is where the great tragedy of his middle life began. Hera, who had never stopped hating him, sent a fit of madness upon him. The madness was sudden and overwhelming. Heracles did not know what he was doing. In the grip of the madness, he killed his own children. Some traditions say he killed Megara as well. When the madness lifted and he saw what he had done, his grief was beyond anything he had ever felt. He wanted to die. He wandered out into the wilderness, intending to take his own life. We will pass this moment gently. The sleep story does not press the sharpest sorrows. We will only mark that Heracles, in his middle life, suffered the deepest possible grief through no fault of his own conscious will. He had been the instrument of his own family's destruction. The strength that had made him a hero had also, in the hour of madness, made him a destroyer. The Greeks honored the complexity of this. They did not let their hero off the moral hook, but they also did not condemn him, because he had not been himself when the killings happened. There is, in the Greek understanding of madness sent by the gods, a particular kind of sorrow that does not resolve cleanly into either guilt or innocence. The person who acts in divine madness is and is not responsible. They are themselves and not themselves simultaneously. The act was done with their hands and through their body, but the intention was not theirs. It was borrowed or imposed by a force beyond their will. This does not excuse what happened. Nothing excuses what happened. But it places it in a different category from deliberate murder. And the Greeks, who were deeply interested in the distinctions between categories of guilt, insisted on maintaining the difference. Heracles had not murdered his children. He had been made into a weapon by the hatred of a goddess, and the children had been the victims of that weapon. The distinction mattered enormously to the Greeks. It did not make the grief less. It made the grief different. Heracles eventually accepted that he could not undo what he had done. He could only try to do something with the rest of his life. He went to the oracle at Delphi to ask what he should do. The oracle told him to go to his cousin Eurystheus, the cousin who had stolen his birthright, and to serve him for 12 years. Eurystheus would set him a series of tasks. The completion of these tasks would purify him of his crime. This is how the 12 labors began. Heracles, who could have refused, accepted the oracle's verdict. He went to Eurystheus and offered his service. Eurystheus, who feared his cousin's strength, conceived a series of tasks that he hoped would result in Heracles' death. The tasks were the hardest the king could imagine. Each was a different kind of impossible. The first labor was the killing of the Nemean Lion. The lion lived in the hills near the town of Nemea in the northeastern Peloponnese. Its skin was impervious to weapons. No spear could pierce it. No arrow could find a vital spot. The lion was killing the local shepherds and their flocks, descending from the hills at night and taking whatever it wished, and the people of Nemea had no means of stopping it. They had tried. The lion wore their attempts without noticing them. Heracles tracked it to its cave. He shot arrows at it. The arrows bounced off. He tried his sword. It broke against the lion's hide. Finally, in close combat, he wrestled the lion to the ground and strangled it with his bare hands. He then took the lion's skin, using one of its own claws to cut it, since no other tool could penetrate what the hide was made of. The lion's skin became his cloak. He wore it for the rest of his heroic life. It was both his armor and his trophy, the visible reminder of the first impossible task he had completed, and in later centuries it became the sign by which everyone recognized him at once. The great man in the lion's skin, the hero who had begun his impossible work. The second labor was the killing of the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra was a many-headed serpent that lived in the marshes near the spring of Lerna, a place of perpetual damp and thick reed beds, and the particular smell of stagnant water in summer heat. When one of its heads was cut off, 2 new heads grew back in its place. The poison of its blood was lethal, and the mere breath of the creature was dangerous to anyone who stood too close. Heracles approached the marsh with his nephew Iolaus, the son of his brother Iphicles, who had agreed to assist him. Heracles cut off the heads one by one. Iolaus, following behind with a burning torch, cauterized the necks before new heads could grow. After many heads, the last head, which was said to be immortal, was buried under a great stone where it could not regenerate. Heracles then dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood. From that day on, his arrows carried a deadly venom that no mortal could survive. The third labor was the capture of the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer of Artemis with golden antlers and bronze hooves. The deer was sacred and could not be killed. Heracles had to take it alive. He chased the deer for a full year across mountains and rivers, through forests and over open plains, never quite catching it, always a few paces behind, the deer's golden antlers catching the light ahead of him as it ran. At last, by the river Ladon, he wounded it with a careful arrow that pinned its leg without killing it. He then carried the deer back to Eurystheus on his shoulders. On the way, Artemis met him. She was furious that he had wounded her sacred animal. Heracles explained the situation, apologized, and promised to return the deer to her after showing it to Eurystheus. Artemis, who could see the truth of his situation, accepted his explanation. He showed the deer to Eurystheus, then released it. The deer ran back into the forest. Artemis was satisfied. The labor had required patience more than strength, a year of patient following, a year of endurance, a year of not quitting when the deer was always just ahead and the seasons turned from summer to winter to spring again. The fourth labor was the capture of the Erymanthian boar, a great wild boar that lived on Mount Erymanthus. Heracles tracked it through deep snow on the upper slopes, driving it through the drifts until it was exhausted and trapped in a snowdrift where it could not move. He bound it. He carried it back to Eurystheus alive. Eurystheus, when he saw the great snorting bound boar being carried into his courtyard on Heracles' shoulders, was so frightened that he hid in a large bronze jar. From that day, the old tradition says, Eurystheus often hid in the jar when Heracles returned from his labors. The image is darkly comic. The cousin who had stolen the kingship, the king who set the impossible tasks, was, in his own way, a coward who hid from his successful servant. He had set the labors hoping they would kill Heracles, and each time Heracles returned alive, the king found that he had produced only another victory for the man he feared. The jar was perhaps the most honest thing about Eurystheus. The fifth labor was the cleaning of the Augean stables in a single day. King Augeas of Elis had immense herds of cattle, thousands of head, and the stables in which they were kept had not been cleaned for many years, perhaps decades, perhaps longer. The accumulation of manure was enormous, a task that no ordinary labor force could have completed in a generation, let alone a day. Heracles, instead of cleaning by hand, diverted two rivers, the Alpheos and the Peneos, through the stables. The rushing water washed away the manure in a single day. The stables were clean. The labor was completed by intelligence rather than by strength alone. The Greeks loved this story. It showed that Heracles, though famous for his strength, was also capable of cleverness when cleverness was the appropriate solution. The man who wrestled lions could also redirect rivers. The same mind that planned a wrestling hold could plan a hydraulic project. Strength and wit were not opposites in his character. They were the same quality working in different directions. The sixth labor was the driving away of the Stymphalian birds, a flock of bronze-beaked birds that nested in the marshes near Lake Stymphalia and that were devouring the crops and livestock of the local people. The birds had beaks and feathers of metal that they could shed like arrows, and they could not be reached on foot because of the marshy ground that surrounded their nesting place. Athena gave Heracles a bronze rattle made by Hephaestus. He climbed to a high vantage point above the marsh and shook the rattle. The sound was unlike anything the birds had heard before, a great bronze clanging that cut through the marsh air and startled the entire flock into the sky at once. As they rose in a dark cloud above the water, Heracles shot them down one by one with his poisoned arrows. The marsh was cleared. The labor was completed with the help of his divine patroness, who had watched over him since his earliest years, and who continued to offer what help she could within the rules that governed the labors. The seventh labor was the capture of the Cretan bull. The bull had been a gift to King Minos of Crete from Poseidon, but Minos had failed to sacrifice it properly, choosing instead to keep it for himself and offer a lesser animal to the god. Poseidon, insulted, had driven the bull to madness. The bull had gone wild, ravaging the fields of Crete and spreading terror through the island's countryside. Heracles travelled to the island. He found the bull in the open land beyond the city. He wrestled it to the ground through sheer sustained force, holding the enormous animal against the earth until its strength was spent. He bound it. He carried it back to mainland Greece on a ship, the great bull standing in the hold, still muscular but no longer wild. The bull was eventually released and later captured by Theseus near Marathon, where it would feature in another hero's story entirely, connecting the labours of Heracles to the adventures of the man who would be Athens' own great hero. The eighth labour was the capture of the mares of Diomedes, a king of Thrace who fed his horses on human flesh. The horses, made wild and violent by their unnatural diet, could not be approached by ordinary means. Their stalls smelled of iron, and their eyes were not the eyes of horses. Heracles met Diomedes in combat, and the king fell. The old poets told the rest in different ways, and none of the ways were gentle, so we will pass over that part quickly, with the distance that old stories allow. What matters for the night is this. With their master gone, the mares grew quiet at last, as if the wildness had belonged to him and not to them. They allowed themselves to be bridled and led. Heracles brought them back to Eurystheus, and the eighth labour was done. The ninth labour was the obtaining of the girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. The girdle was a gift from Ares, the god of war, marking Hippolyta's authority and her particular excellence among her people. Eurystheus's daughter wanted the girdle as a gift. Heracles travelled to the land of the Amazons with a company of men. He met with Hippolyta on the shore. The queen, impressed by his fame and his honest request, agreed to give him the girdle freely. This was unexpected. The negotiations had gone well. The labour seemed close to completion without violence. But Hera, always working against him, disguised herself as an Amazon and spread a rumour through the camp that Heracles intended to abduct their queen. The Amazons attacked. A battle followed in the confusion of alarm and misunderstanding. Hippolyta, in the chaos, was killed. Heracles took the girdle and sailed home with grief he had not expected to feel. The labour was completed, but at the cost of a queen who had meant to be a friend. The Greeks understood that even successful labours could have terrible byproducts, that the world did not always arrange itself so that doing the right thing left no damage behind. The 10th labour was the cattle of Geryon, a three-bodied giant who lived on the island of Erythea in the far west, at the edge of the known world where the sun dipped into the ocean each evening. Heracles travelled to the edge of the known world. He killed the giant Geryon and his two-headed guard dog Orthrus. He drove the cattle back across the entire breadth of the Mediterranean, fighting various adventures along the way, in Libya and in Italy, and in the lands that would one day be known as Spain. The journey westward, in the old tradition, took him through regions that had not yet been named, through landscapes that no Greek had mapped. He set up 2 pillars at the Strait of Gibraltar, which became known as the Pillars of Hercules. The pillars marked the edge of the known world. Beyond them lay the unknown ocean. The Greeks of later centuries imagined Heracles as the hero who had reached the furthest western edge of the world that mortals could safely visit, who had planted a monument at the end of what was mappable, who had gone as far as the world allowed and come back. The 11th labour was the obtaining of the golden apples of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were the daughters of Atlas, nymphs of the evening, who tended a garden of golden apples at the far edge of the world where the sky met the sea. The garden was guarded by a dragon named Ladon, who coiled without sleeping around the tree at its centre. Heracles travelled to the garden after a long journey that took him through many lands and required him to solve many smaller problems along the way. He met Atlas, who was holding up the sky on his shoulders at the edge of the world, the sky pressing down on him like a permanent and immovable burden. Heracles offered to hold up the sky temporarily if Atlas would go and fetch the apples. Atlas agreed, glad to be relieved of his burden for even a short time. He fetched the apples easily, since the dragon would not harm him. But when he returned, he tried to trick Heracles into continuing to hold the sky permanently, saying he would take the apples to Eurystheus himself. Heracles, equally clever, asked Atlas to take the sky back for just a moment so he could adjust his cloak for comfort. Atlas, fooled by the reasonableness of this request, took back the sky. Heracles picked up the apples and walked away. The labour had required cleverness as much as strength, and the cleverness had won it. The 12th labour, the last and the hardest, was the capture of Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guarded the entrance to the underworld. Heracles descended into the underworld through a cave that led down and down into the earth, following the road that the dead followed and that the living were not supposed to walk. He met the shades of those who had died. He met Hades, the king of the dead, seated on his throne of black stone in the Hall of Judgment. Hades agreed that Heracles could take Cerberus to the upper world, but only if he subdued the dog without weapons. Heracles put aside his bow and his arrows and his club. He wrestled Cerberus into submission with his bare hands alone, holding the 3 heads still while the great body struggled and the triple mouth snapped at the air. He brought the great hound up into the daylight. Eurystheus, when he saw Cerberus, was again terrified. He hid in his jar. Heracles returned Cerberus to the underworld unharmed, as he had promised. The 12 labours were complete. The penance was done. Good evening and welcome back. If your mind has wandered through the long list of labours, the figures have multiplied. The lion of Nemea, the Hydra of Lerna, the hind of Cerynea, the boar of Erymanthus, the stables of Augeas, the birds of Stymphalia, the bull of Crete, the mares of Diomedes, the girdle of Hippolyta, the cattle of Geryon, the apples of the Hesperides, the hound of Hades, 12 impossible tasks completed one by one across 12 years of patient effort. The greatest hero of the Greek world had earned his purification. Let those images settle, like stones settling to the bed of a clear river, finding their places one by one in the long record of his deeds. Each labor had taken something from him and given something back. The lion had given him his armor, the Hydra his weapons, the hind his patience, the boar his cunning. The middle labors had taught him to use his mind before his strength and to accept help with gratitude when it was offered. The later ones had carried him to foreign shores and to the western edge of the world, had given him griefs he had not expected, and had asked him, at the last, to face death itself and walk out again alive. 12 years of work, and each year had left its mark on him and its lesson in him. But the labours were not the end of Heracles' story. After the 12 years of service to Eurystheus were complete, he was a free man again. But he was also a man without a home. Thebes was no longer his city in the way it had been. Megara and the children were dead. He had nowhere to settle. So he wandered. He took up other adventures. He helped various heroes in their quests. He joined the Argonauts on their voyage for the Golden Fleece for a time. Though he did not complete the entire journey, having been left behind in Mysia when his young companion Hylas was abducted by water nymphs, and Heracles refused to leave until he found him. The ship sailed on without him. He was not on the ship when the Golden Fleece was taken. He was in Mysia, alone, searching the shores of a lake for a boy who had gone into the water and not come out. This is the kind of man Heracles was. He could not leave. He fought the giant Antaeus in Libya, a son of Poseidon and Gaia who drew strength from his contact with the earth. Every time Heracles threw him to the ground, Antaeus rose stronger than before. The first few times he threw the giant down, Heracles simply watched in puzzlement as Antaeus stood again, renewed, more powerful than before, as though the ground itself was feeding him through the soles of his feet. Heracles had to stop and think. He had to look at what was happening rather than simply doing more of what was not working. When he understood the mechanism, he lifted the giant into the air and held him there, off the earth, suspended above his source of strength, and crushed him while he had no ground to renew himself from. The trick required intelligence as well as strength. The mere force of Heracles was not enough. He had to understand what he was dealing with before he could overcome it. In Libya, he also met Busiris, a king of Egypt who sacrificed every stranger who entered his kingdom to Zeus, following the advice of a seer who had told him that human sacrifice would end a long drought. Heracles allowed himself to be bound and led to the altar. At the moment of the sacrifice, he broke his bonds and killed Busiris and his sons and his priests and put an end to the practice. The story has a particular quality that the Greeks admired: the capacity to allow a thing to develop further than most people would tolerate, trusting that the moment to act would arrive, and acting at exactly that moment with decisive force. It was a quality Heracles showed again and again, the ability to endure indignity or discomfort long enough to arrive at the right moment rather than acting prematurely. He fought the river god Hercules, who could change his shape by breaking off one of his horns when the river was in bull form. The horn became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. that would appear in many later mythological scenes. He freed Prometheus from his rock in the Caucasus, shooting the eagle that came each day to tear at the Titan's liver. Prometheus had been bound there for ages, the eagle returning each morning to renew a torment that could not end by any ordinary means. The liver grew back each night. The eagle descended each dawn. The cycle had been running since before the heroic age, since before Heracles was born, since before his father Zeus had fathered any mortal children at all. Heracles ended it. He stood at the base of the Caucasus peak, in the cold wind that blew from the east, and he looked up at the great bird descending in its slow arcs toward the rock, and he drew his bow and shot, and the eagle fell, and the chain broke, and Prometheus, who had given fire to humanity, was free. It was perhaps the most generous thing Heracles ever did, a deed that cost him nothing he could not afford and gave back to the world a figure whose absence had left something unfinished for a very long time. There is another story of his generosity, gentler than most, and it is worth a quiet moment here. In his wanderings he came once as a guest to the house of a king named Admetus, and was received with warm hospitality and feasted and given a place to rest. But Heracles did not know, for his host hid it from him out of courtesy, that the house was in deep mourning, for it had been fated that Admetus must die unless someone could be found to die in his place. And no one would, not his aged father, not his mother, none of his friends or servants, until at last his own wife, the gentle Queen Alcestis, had freely offered her life for his, and had died that very day so that her husband might live. Admetus, grieving but unwilling to turn a guest from his door, said nothing of it, and let Heracles feast in a far room. But Heracles soon learned the truth from a servant, and was ashamed to have been merry in a house of such sorrow, and resolved to set it right in the only way he knew. He went out to the tomb where Alcestis had been laid, and there he waited in the dark for Death himself to come and claim her, and when Death came, Heracles seized him and wrestled him, the strongest of mortals grappling with the power that takes all mortals, holding on through the cold struggle until Death yielded and gave up his prize. Then Heracles led Alcestis, alive again, back to the house of her husband, veiled, and gave her into the hands of the grieving Admetus, and lifted the veil, and restored the wife to the husband and the queen to the house. It is one of the few stories in all his mythology where his great strength is turned not against a monster but against death itself, on behalf of love, and where the gift he gives is simply a life given back to the one who had lost it. He took Hesione, daughter of King Laomedon of Troy, from a sea monster sent by Poseidon, rescuing her from the rock to which she had been chained as a sacrifice. Laomedon had promised him a fine reward of divine horses. When the rescue was done, Laomedon refused to pay. Heracles returned with ships and soldiers and sacked the city, installing a friendlier king on Troy's throne. The first sack of Troy was Heracles' work, in the generation before Achilles and Agamemnon brought their armies. The city was taken once and rebuilt, and it would be taken again. He fell in love several times, He had children with women in many cities, and the mythology records some of them and omits most of them, the way the sea keeps some of what it takes and returns the rest without explanation. He married a second time, to Deianira, Princess of Caledon, a woman of strong will and deep feeling, who understood from the beginning that the man she had married was not a man who could be kept in one place. She had not been deceived about this. She had known when she agreed to marry him that she was agreeing to a particular kind of life. She made what peace she could with his wandering. She stayed in their home when he was away and managed the household and raised their children and waited. He came back. He always came back. She loved him and was afraid of losing him, and those two feelings, love and fear, would in the end bring everything down. There is a version of their courtship that deserves a moment of description. When Heracles sought Deianira's hand, he had a rival, the river god Achilles, who had also come to ask for her. Her father, Oeneus, king of Caledon, told both suitors that the one who won a contest between them would have her hand. The contest was a wrestling match. Achilles was a god of ancient power. He could change his shape. First he appeared as a man, then as a serpent, then as a great bull. Each form was formidable. Each time he changed his shape, Heracles adapted to it. When Achilles became the bull, Heracles grabbed one of the horns and wrestled him to the ground and broke the horn off. The river god, defeated and humiliated, yielded. The horn became the cornucopia. Deianira had watched the match from a distance. She had seen this extraordinary man fight a river god and win. She had seen him change tactics each time the opponent changed form. She had seen him smile when the horn came free. Not the smile of a cruel man, but the smile of a man who had solved a problem he was interested in. She agreed to the marriage with something that was not entirely reluctant. The death of Heracles came through a misunderstanding between Deianira and a centaur named Nessus. The centaur had been hired to ferry travelers across a river. He agreed to carry Deianira across the water while Heracles swam or waded beside them. But in the middle of the river, Nessus tried to abduct Deianira, pulling her away from the shore while she cried out for Heracles. Heracles, on the far bank, heard her. He shot Nessus with one of his poisoned arrows. The arrow struck true. As Nessus lay dying at the water's edge, his wound burning with the Hydra's venom, he gave Deianira a terrible gift. He told her that his blood, collected before it dried, would serve as a love charm. If she ever feared that Heracles was drifting from her, she should anoint a garment with the centaur's blood and give it to him to wear. The love would return and hold. Deianira, shaken by what had just happened, unsure whether to believe the dying creature's words, collected the blood. She kept it. She hoped she would never need it. Many years later, when Heracles was away on a campaign and Deianira heard that he had taken a young captive princess named Iole as his concubine, she remembered the vial. She was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one. She did not want to destroy him. She wanted to keep him. She sent him a robe soaked in Nessus's blood, hoping the love potion would do what the centaur had promised. The blood was of course poisoned by the Hydra's venom that had been on the arrow that killed Nessus. Nessus had taken his revenge from his deathbed with a patience that only the dying possess. He had known that the blood was poison. He had known that the venom of the Hydra, once on an arrow and once in a wound, could not be washed out of what it touched. He had known that Deianira's love and fear would do the rest of the work for him. Eventually, in some future moment, he would not live to see. Heracles put the robe on. The Hydra's venom began to burn his skin. It could not be removed. The robe clung to him and burned deeper the more he tried to pull it free. The pain was immense, unlike anything he had endured in all his years of impossible labor. The Lion of Nemean had not done this. The wrestling of the three-headed dog had not done this. This was a burning that went inward, that did not stop, that grew worse with every attempt to resist it. Heracles, unable to live with the burning robe, ordered his son Hylas to build him a great pyre on Mount Oeta. Hylas did so with grief he could not speak. Heracles climbed onto the pyre. He asked his companion Philoctetes to light it. Philoctetes did so in exchange for Heracles' bow and his poisoned arrows, the weapons that had made so many of the labors possible, and that now, in the hands of a new owner, would go on to their own future in the war at Troy. The pyre burned. Heracles' mortal body was consumed. But the immortal part of him, the part that came from Zeus, was lifted up by the gods into Olympus. He became, after his death, an immortal god. He was reconciled to Hera at last, in some traditions, as though the hatred that had driven his entire life finally exhausted itself in the fire on the mountain and left nothing behind but the possibility of peace. He married Hebe, the goddess of youth, the daughter of Zeus and Hera. He took his place among the gods. The man who had spent his entire mortal life in struggle was finally given the rest he had never had as a living man. Deianira, when she understood what she had done, did not survive the knowledge. She had killed the husband she loved. It had not been her intention. The intention had been love and fear and the desperate hope of a woman who could see her marriage slipping away. The intention had been the centaur's lie and her trust in it. The intention had been everything except what happened. The Greeks understood this too. The mythology of Heracles at nearly every turn is a story of terrible consequences arising from actions whose intentions were not terrible. The madness that killed his children, the poison that killed him, the lie that set the whole mechanism in motion. None of these things began with a desire to destroy. They began with love, with hatred, with fear, with the ordinary and extraordinary feelings that move through mortal lives and sometimes, in the presence of the god's interest, take on catastrophic scale. For now, remember this. Heracles, more than any other Greek hero, lived a life of unrelenting effort. He killed monsters. He traveled to the ends of the earth. He visited the underworld and returned from it twice, once to complete his labor and once to rescue a friend. He freed Prometheus from an eternal torment. He helped to found cities. He cleared the world of dangers that had plagued it since before the heroic age. He also, in his moments of madness or misunderstanding, harmed those he loved. He was not a simple hero. He was, in the full Greek view, a complicated figure whose strength was both his gift and his curse. The gift and the curse were inseparable. You could not have one without the other. The strength that strangled serpents in the cradle was the same strength that, in the hour of divine madness, destroyed everything he had made. The Greeks loved him with a particular fondness. He was not the philosophical hero of Athens. He was not the clever hero of Ithaca. He was the strong, patient hero of the Greek countryside, the man who showed up when monsters had to be killed, who endured what he had to endure, who carried impossible burdens because no one else could carry them. The farmers and shepherds of the Peloponnese honored him at small altars in their fields. The travelers carried small images of him for protection on long roads. The soldiers wore his lion skin emblem on their shields. He was the hero of practical strength, of impossible work performed without complaint, of the slow, steady wearing down of obstacles that ordinary mortals could not have overcome. His 12 labors became, in later Greek thought, a kind of allegory for the human life. Each labor represented a different kind of struggle that a mortal might face. The lion was the test of physical strength against a problem that could not be solved at a distance. The Hydra was the test of patience against ever-renewing troubles, against the problems that multiply when you address only the surface of them. The deer was the test of patience and persistence over a long time, of following without giving up when the thing being pursued stays just ahead. The boar was the test of cunning combined with strength. The stables were the test of intelligence, of finding the elegant solution to a problem too large for brute force. The birds were the test of using help wisely, of accepting the tools that a wiser being offers. The bull was the test of courage in foreign lands. The mares were the test of facing the inhumane without becoming inhumane. The girdle was the test of diplomacy gone wrong, of innocent intentions producing terrible outcomes. The cattle were the test of long voyages, of persisting over a distance so great that the destination seems unreachable. The apples were the test of intellectual cleverness, of matching wits with someone who has more to gain from deception than from honesty. The hound was the test of facing death itself, descending into the place all mortals feared most, and walking out again. The 12 together formed a kind of curriculum for the soul. What is notable about this curriculum is that it is not arranged in order of difficulty. Not exactly, not in a way that permits simple ranking. The later labors were not always harder than the earlier ones in the same dimension. They were harder in different ways. The first was hard in the way that every first thing is hard, the way that the first real test reveals what a person is actually made of when the preparation ends and the encounter begins. The fifth was hard in a different way, hard in the way that requires setting aside the first answer and finding a better one. Hard in the way that asks a person to be more than the most obvious version of themselves. The 12th was hard in the way that facing the fundamental certainty of mortality is hard for every living thing. the way that descending toward the end and choosing to return from it requires a specific courage that has nothing to do with strength of body and everything to do with strength of intention. The Greeks who told these stories were not only entertaining, they were teaching. They were passing on a body of thought about what the heroic life required and what it cost and what it meant. The mythology was also a philosophy, carried in stories because stories are what people remember when the argument has faded. The figure of Heracles, moving from labor to labor with the lion's skin on his shoulders and the club in his hand, was a figure that every Greek child knew, and every Greek adult recognized in themselves at the moments when their own life asked them for something they were not sure they could give. This allegorical reading was developed particularly in late antiquity by Stoic philosophers and later by thinkers who saw in Heracles a figure of moral effort and endurance. The figure became increasingly philosophical in later European traditions. The Renaissance and Baroque painters often showed him as the hero of virtue, the man who chose the difficult path over the easy path, the figure of moral effort turned toward the good. These later interpretations were not the original Greek meaning, but they were not unfaithful to it either. The deep figure of patient struggle that the Greeks had honored was being read by later traditions in their own ways, and what they saw in him was not wrong, only differently framed. But that is a story for another day. The long afterlife of Heracles in European art and thought. Tonight we will only mark it. We will only note that the man with the lion skin, the man with the club, the man with the bow and the poisoned arrows, the man who carried the world for a few hours and who broke the horns of river gods and who descended to the underworld and returned, has been one of the most enduring images in all of Western culture, recognized even by those who do not know any of the specific stories. The shape of him, the patient, strong man performing impossible tasks, is part of the long human imagination. Around Heracles, in the old imagery, gathered certain animals and signs. The lion was his, particularly through the Nemean Lion's skin that he wore from his first labor to his last day. The club was his, the great wooden club he had cut from a wild olive tree in the hills above Nemea when all other weapons had failed him. The bow and arrows were his, the bow he had learned to use under Eurytus, the arrows poisoned with the Hydra's blood, the arrows that could kill at a distance what his hands could not reach. The cup of the sun was his, briefly, when the sun god Helios had loaned him his golden cup as a boat to cross the Western Ocean during his 10th labor, and the image of Heracles sailing in a golden cup across the world's edge is one of the strangest and most beautiful in all his mythology. The cornucopia, the horn of plenty, was his, taken from the river god Achilles and given to the nymphs of the river who filled it with fruits and flowers, and it became in later times the symbol of abundance and of the earth's generosity. His many children were his, scattered across the Greek world. He had, in his wandering middle life, fathered many sons in many cities, and these sons carried his strength and something of his restlessness into the next generation. These sons were called the Heraclids, and their descendants would later claim the right to return to the Peloponnese and to inherit kingdoms across the region. The historical Dorian invasion of Greece around the 11th century before our era was understood by the Greeks as the return of the Heraclids, the descendants of Heracles, reclaiming the homelands their ancestor had wandered through. The Spartan kings in historical times claimed direct descent from Heracles. The hero's bloodline, in the Greek imagination, was woven through the actual political history of their society in ways that made him not only a mythological figure, but an ancestor, a founder, a source of legitimate authority reaching from the mythic age into historical memory. It simply was in the old Greek imagination that strength was a kind of fate. To be born strong was both a gift and a burden. Heracles had been the strongest of all mortals. His life had been correspondingly hard. He had not been able to live the small, quiet life of an ordinary man, tending a garden and watching children grow and aging gently in a warm house. The strength had pulled him into struggles he might not have chosen. The strength had also, in his hours of madness, caused him to harm those he loved. The Greeks understood this trade-off. They did not pretend that being the strongest was a simple blessing. They allowed Heracles his sorrows. They let him grieve. They let the man who had carried the world on his shoulders for an afternoon be brought down by a robe soaked in old poison. Because they knew that strength is not immunity, and greatness does not protect a person from the ordinary and extraordinary ways that life finds to break the heart. There is a long meditation possible on what it means to be the strongest being who has ever lived as a mortal. Every door Heracles walked through was a door he had to be careful not to break. Every hand he offered in greeting was a hand that had to hold itself in restraint. Every time he embraced someone he loved, he embraced them with a grip that could have crushed them. And the tenderness was the constant and enormous effort of holding that power back. The strength was never absent. It was always there, always present, always requiring management. Most people are not aware of the effort required to hold strength back. They experience strength as something they do not have, something they wish for in moments of difficulty. Heracles was aware of it every moment of his mortal life. The effort was not just the labors, the effort was the daily, quiet, constant management of what he was. The labors were simply the moments when he was permitted to stop managing it and to let it be what it was. This may be part of why the Greeks felt such particular tenderness for him. He was not a god who lived in ease on Olympus. He was not a clever man whose primary skill was avoiding the direct encounter. He was a man who had to carry an extraordinary capacity every day, in the small ordinary situations as much as in the grand impossible ones, and who did so without complaint, and who sometimes in the gaps between the labors managed to build a quiet life, to marry, to have children, to sit in the evening beside a fire in a house that was his own and feel for a while the peace that comes when the weight is briefly set down. There is in the figure of Heracles a particular kind of dignity that the Greeks honored. It was the dignity of the man who keeps going, who endures the next labor, Who shoulders the next impossible task? Who does not complain? Who does not boast? Who, when he has finished one task, walks toward the next one? The dignity is not the dignity of the philosophical thinker or the clever speaker. It is the dignity of the worker, the hero of the long road, the man who, when the road is hard, walks it anyway. This dignity is one of the oldest things in human culture. It appears in Heracles, and it appears in the long tradition of labor hymns and in the stories told by people who work with their bodies, and it appears in the private thoughts of anyone who has ever had to do something genuinely difficult and has done it without applause, without recognition, without anyone watching. The man who carries the lion's skin is carrying something that most people will never carry. But the quality that allowed him to carry it, the patient endurance, the willingness to show up, the refusal to quit before the task is complete, that quality is available to every mortal who has ever lived. It is perhaps the most democratic thing in the entire mythology of Heracles. He was stronger than anyone. But the virtue he modeled was within the reach of everyone. This is, perhaps, the gentlest gift of the Heracles myth for a sleep story. The day's work, when it is honest, is hard. The week's work is harder. The month's work, the year's work, the life's work, all of it requires the slow, patient endurance of someone who keeps showing up when showing up is necessary. Heracles, in his unending tasks, is the model of this endurance. He did not have an easy life, but he had a life that mattered. And at the end of it, when his mortal body was consumed on the pyre, he was lifted up to the gods. The man who had been born of a deception in the night, who had strangled serpents in a cradle, who had carried the labours of 12 years on his back, who had wandered the Greek world and the world beyond the Greek world, who had descended into death and come back, who had been burned by a poison he did not deserve and had lit his own pyre rather than endure the burning any longer, that man was lifted up. He was taken into Olympus. He was given rest. The gods received him. Hera, who had hated him from before his birth, made her peace with him at last. The pyre on Mount Oeta is one of the lasting images of his story. The hero, in his final hour, choosing the fire over the unbearable burning of the poisoned robe. The flames rising in the dark air above the mountain. The mortal body consumed, returning to the earth from which the mortal part of him had come. The immortal soul lifted up, ascending toward Olympus like the heat of a great fire rising toward the sky. The Greeks did not always offer their heroes this kind of ending. Many of them simply died, and went to the underworld, and faded into the dim half-existence of the shades, walking the asphodel meadows without urgency, without purpose, without the particular brightness of mortal life. Heracles was different. His struggle on earth had been so great, his labours so complete, his endurance so sustained across so many years of impossible effort, that the gods had agreed, in the end, to take him into their company. The pyre was both the end of his mortal life and the beginning of his immortal one. Good evening, and welcome back one last time to the slow, gentle work of letting the story rest. The night has carried Heracles a long way. From the long deceptive night when Zeus came to Alcmene to the lifting up of the immortal hero from the pyre on Oeta. There are many other tellings of him, many other small adventures, many other lovers and companions and enemies. But that is a story for another day. The road of his mythology is wide enough that no single knight can walk all its paths. The night is older now, and the story has carried us far. Let us gather some final figures and let them settle. The young Heracles being tutored by Chiron the centaur, learning medicine and music and philosophy in the high meadows of Pelion. The first marriage to Megara in Thebes, the children, the brief, happy years before the madness, the terrible fit of madness sent by Hera, the family destroyed through no deliberate fault of his own will. The oracle at Delphi, the verdict, the journey to Eurystheus, and the offering of service to the cousin who had stolen his birthright. The 12 labours, 12 images of impossible work made possible by patient strength, the lion's skin worn for the rest of his life as armour and as testament, the club from the wild olive tree cut in the hills above Nemea when all other weapons failed, the bow with its poisoned arrows. The 2 pillars at the western edge of the world marking the boundary between the known and the unknown. The cup of Helios, the golden boat that crossed the outer ocean. The cornucopia of Aculus, the horn that would fill with flowers forever. The freeing of Prometheus from his rock in the Caucasus, the eagle shot from the sky after ages of torment. The wanderings of the middle years, city to city, adventure to adventure, restless in the way that only the very strong can be restless. The second marriage to Deianira, the long patient years of a woman waiting for her husband to come home. The Hydra poisoned robe and the centaur's long, slow revenge. The pyre on Mount Oeta, lit by a faithful companion requested by a man who chose fire over unbearable burning. The lifting up to Olympus. The marriage to Hebe, goddess of youth. The reconciliation with Hera, at last, after a lifetime of her hatred driving him from one end of the world to the other. The reception into the gathering of the gods. The Heracles spreading across the Peloponnese for generations to come, carrying his blood and his name into the long future of the Greek world. These are the figures of Heracles' mythology, and you do not have to hold them. They are mentioned only so that they may settle. Let the names drift down like leaves into water. Let the images soften. Let the long history of the strongest of the heroes become a quiet weight in the room, the way a lion's skin folded by a fire is a quiet weight. Holding without insisting, warm from the fire but no longer demanding anything from the hand that holds it. Now let the story loosen, the way every long telling must when sleep approaches. The world that Heracles moved through was a world that needed him. The monsters were real in the old imagination, real in the way that every danger is real when there is no one yet strong enough to face it. Each creature he killed had been making the world harder for ordinary people. The Lion of Nemea had been killing shepherds. The Hydra had been poisoning the marshes of Lerna. The birds of Stymphalia had been devouring crops. Each labour was not only a feat, it was an act of service. The world, when Heracles was done with the labours, was safer than it had been before. He had cleared it. He had made room in it for the people who could not have done what he did. Let the Lion of Nemea rest in his cave, finally at peace, the long hunt over. Let the Hydra of Lerna rest in her marsh, her many heads no longer threatening anyone, the water above her quiet and the reeds still. Let the cattle of Geryon graze quietly in some bright meadow at the western edge of the world, far from any labour, far from any task. Let the apples of the Hesperides hang quietly from their tree, golden in the dim light of the far western dusk, the dragon laden asleep at the roots, no longer needing to guard what is no longer threatened. Let Cerberus return to his place at the gate of the underworld, his 3 heads laid down on the ground in a sleeping rest, the gate keeping its own counsel in the dark. Let the eagle that had tormented Prometheus stay in some far branch with its wings folded and its eyes closed, no longer hunting, no longer descending, the rock empty and the chain broken. Let the great club rest beside the lion's skin cloak. Let the bow and the poisoned arrows stay in their quiver, in the hands of Philoctetes now, going toward their own destiny at Troy. Let the hero himself rest for tonight, with the burdens of his many tasks set down beside him, the fire on Mount Oeta long since cooled, the sky of Olympus quiet above him. For now, remember this. Tonight, the work of the tale is done. It simply was, like all old stories, the carrying of the strongest of heroes through the long inheritance of nights. Let the names settle. Let the room settle. Let the night gather you up. Imagine the long road of Heracles far behind you, the 12 labours and the wandering middle years and the pyre on the mountain no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the heroic road, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the lion, the hydra, the deer, the boar, the bull, the dog of the underworld, and the long endurance of the hero in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out, and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.